Serious, parents or friends of missing children. What happened? My friend in middle school went missing. No one really thought too much about it. They labeled him a runaway. It wasn't until 6 years after he went missing, his body was found. His friend had shot him and buried his body to cover it up. The kid never said a word about it. It's sad. He was a good friend to me. A kid I went to high school with in South Florida just disappeared one day. Left a party one night and disappeared. His phone lost signal and none of his credit cards were used. They searched for 3 months but never found him or his car. The kid had liked his Benzes and his friends at the party said he was pretty fricked up when he left. About a year or so later some kids were swimming in a canal near a road. The canals in South Florida are usually really deep, 30-40 feet, and are pretty much everywhere. So kids like to jump off of smaller bridges into the canals when it is hot out. A couple kids were daring each other to go as deep as they could and one kid went really deep and hit something hard and metal with his feet. It was the missing kid's car. The cops pulled it up and he was still in it. It was only a few blocks from his house. This happened to a family friend. One day, the nanny just disappeared with their 4-year-old son. They did everything they could to find him, but it's really easy to disappear in Indonesia. About 6 months later, one of their friends was stuck in a traffic jam and realized one of the beggar kids going between cars begging looked a lot like the boy. He wasn't sure, so he called up his friends and they came there around the same time the next day. They recognized the son and called his name. He recognized them too, and they quickly grabbed him into the car and drove off since beggar children in Jakarta are often organized, with mobsters gangsters behind the operation. The kid wouldn't talk for the longest time but now he's fine and apparently doesn't remember about that time of his life anymore. They still don't know where the ex-nanny is or why she decided to kidnap the kid. I know a family who attended a company-sponsored weekend retreat at a mountain lodge for employees and their families. Everybody was arriving on Friday afternoon, and it came time to call everyone into the dining room for dinner. A 5-year-old girl was missing, and was never found. The entire weekend became searching for her, along with hundreds of police officers. In the end it was assumed that she wandered away just far enough to be taken by an animal. It's scary how quickly something like that can happen. My little brother went missing when he was around the age of 3 or 4. One day we were playing in backyard and while I wasn't watching him, he wandered out of our back gate that was open for some reason. The problem was, I or anyone else didn't notice he was gone until hours after he disappeared. They thought he was with me, and I thought he was with them, so 4 hours later the police are called, and my dad is on the edge of tears. But then from about a block down the street we see something incredible. Our dog, who is still alive today at the ripe age of 15 years old, is leading my little brother back toward our house by the collar of his shirt. Needless to say she was treated like a princess for years to come. The dog is probably thinking, dang, humans don't know how to mind their offspring. My mum's best friend's son disappeared one night after going to a club with a bunch of friends. Initially she wasn't too worried cause he was 16 and disappeared for a bit now and then, but after a day she started to get worried and started to call around his friends. His friends told her he'd met a guy he knew from primary school who'd just been released from juvenile and bogged off with him for a reunion. He then disappeared. She phoned the cops. The cops sent around a few people. They'd discovered the remains of 2 boys around 16 years old who'd been tied in chicken wire, tortured to death with power tools, belt sanders and drills, then set on fire. Dental records matched her son. Apparently from what could be pieced together he went out to have some fun and met a childhood friend, but the Northern Irish UVF had decided his friend was actually an informer and tortured them both to death with belt sanders and drills in a classic case of mistaken identity. Teacher here. This one will always haunt me. Last day of school teaching 1st grade. Some of our students are picked up by relations and others walk home or are picked up by older siblings, so we don't keep track of who each kid goes with unless we notice someone unfamiliar. This is standard procedure for our school board, although in kindergarten the kids are handed off directly to parents who must be on the student's pickup form. So, last day of school and all things are a bit chaotic as you'd expect. I'm dismissing my students and had several stragglers who were running behind ours still wanted to say goodbye to me, and by the time I got out onto the yard most of my students were gone. One grandparent of a student in my class however, comes rushing over to explain they were running late and here to get their granddaughter. We looked everywhere inside and outside of the school for her, thinking she must have been waiting and was looking for her grandparents before panic began to set in and we realized she wasn't on the school property anymore. This was all happening only a couple weeks after a major kidnap and murder happened just an hour from us and had been national news. The case was on everyone's minds. After deploying the entire school's staff to check nearby playgrounds, several police showed up to search. Staff from neighboring schools pitched in and she was found about an hour later at her grandparents' house, only after her grandpa was very strongly encouraged by police to go and wait for her there. He insisted that his 5-year-old granddaughter couldn't possibly know the route to their house since she's never walked it before and it's 15 minutes away. Turns out when her grandpa wasn't there to get her right away, she decided to walk and knew the whole way. Most terrifying couple of hours of many of our careers that afternoon. Glad there was a happy ending. My ex-girlfriend was kidnapped when she was a little girl. She said she was playing out in the yard and a man and a woman came up to her. She said they told her to come with them and she followed them. She lived in a really rural area and most everyone knew each other in the area, so the community was really close. They took her back to their house and put her in kids' room. There were toys and everything there and they treated her like their daughter. She remembers being upset but not actually scared because she couldn't understand the gravity of the situation. They treated her pretty normally besides not letting her go outside, and she said they didn't hurt her or abuse her. She said she was missing for about 3 days before one day her dad came with the police to these people's house and took her back. Luckily her dad had been in the backyard and seen the car driving away and the police were able to use that information to find them. She said she asked him about it and he described it briefly. He said he couldn't sleep for 3 days and spent as much time as he could searching for the car and trying to give as much info to the police as he could. She said the only thing that stopped him from physically beating these people was the fact they weren't in the house when the police entered. I was classmates with a missing kid who was missing because she was actually the kidnapper of another missing kid. She was 14 or 15 and lost her crap for some reason. She kidnapped this little boy and took him out into the woods, tied him to a tree, and abused him. They were missing for like a week. They went to the same church, so when they were both reported missing around the same time, people just assumed they were kidnapped together. After they were found, we learned otherwise. She was sent away for treatment somewhere and she never came back to school. I don't know what became of her. There was a guy who worked at a pizza joint near me. His name was Michael Devlin. He was an average Joe, friendly enough, lived by himself or so everyone thought. One day a 13-year-old boy named Ben Ownby got off the school bus and was immediately abducted. Witnesses described the truck used to take him, and soon police descended upon Michael Devlin's apartment. Inside his apartment was the missing Ben Ownby, but also another boy, a 15-year-old boy named Sean Hornbeck, who had been abducted by Michael Devlin 2 years ago and had been held captive ever since. Devlin decided that Sean was now too old to pleasure him and Ben was to be his replacement after Sean was killed off. This time there was a happy ending. Both Sean and Ben were returned to their families and Devlin is now serving 3 life sentences. Most missing children stories do not have such a happy ending. The summer between my junior and senior years of high school, one of my friends went missing. All the info we had was that she was going for a run. Her car was found at a dog park with her wallet inside. The dog park was also near a trailhead. She had texted a selfie with that landscape in the background. Her parents tried to trace her phone activity, and we found her phone had been used a few times only to find out later that that information was incorrect. Volunteers from church helped the police search night and day. The search itself was dangerous, as the terrain of the trail was really rugged and steep. On the 2nd or 3rd day, a helicopter joined the search. They saw her at the bottom of a cliff. We'll never know exactly what happened, but all circumstantial evidence points to suicide. Her family was so torn up that, 2 years later, her uncle went to a secluded part of town and killed himself as well. She would have been 24 this month. I had a class in HS with the kid brother of Amber Hageman. The reason why it's called Amber Alert. He wore a shirt with her picture on it one day and my teacher asked if he remembered anything about that day. It was really awkward. I felt bad for the kid because that was a bit rude to ask in front of everyone. My 13-year-old classmate went missing back in 1996. He was a good kid, but a little on the slow side. After a few days, our teachers told us what was going on and the parents organized search parties. We thought he had wandered off and become lost. A week later, he was discovered in a shallow grave behind a restaurant. Apparently he had stolen his dad's gun and was showing it off to his 11-year-old friend, who accidentally shot him in the face. The kid covered him with dirt and leaves and left him for dead. The autopsy reports showed that he survived the gunshot and died of exposure. What a way to go. Jesus. This is the most heartbreaking of them all for me. This happened over the past year. A girl went missing for a while. Her name was Becky Watts. She was eventually found, but unfortunately she had been killed, and her body cut into pieces. Some parts were in plastic bags taped up and others were in a suitcase. All her limbs were cut from her body and she had been decapitated. She was cut apart with a chop saw and a handsaw. It turned out to be her stepbrother that did this and his girlfriend helped. They've both recently been convicted. My brother was friends with a kid who disappeared one day this summer. 18 years old, just graduated high school. I don't know him or his family personally, but it's a small isolated town, 13k population, so the ripple effects were felt very strongly. It's been nearly 6 months now. Nothing. He's gone and there is a million square miles of forest to search. His family keeps everybody updated and posts on Facebook asking for volunteers to help them comb through whichever new stretch of woods, but nothing ever comes of it. The worst part is watching the mediums from across the country, or continent, show up in the Facebook page and try to swindle his family and friends out of cash by telling them I had a dream, he's a cabin at blank lake etc., which only takes a second of googling to fabricate. It's tragic. I hope they find him, but at this point there's no way he's alive. My aunt's sister's son was kidnapped in Pakistan by the Taliban about a year ago. I don't know the full story that well, but they were a military family and had a large target on their head to begin with. They live near Rawalpindi. It was a home invasion in broad daylight while my aunt's relatives were at home. They ransacked the house, stole all the jewelry, valuables, and took the kid. It was a lengthy ordeal. The Taliban asked for a lot of money. I don't remember the exact amount. I think it was a crore, but it converted to about $100,000 CND. Luckily, money wasn't the issue, rather the reluctance for the Taliban to cooperate after they put the money up. This family was well connected with the Pakistani police, so I'll just say they were lucky to find the kid within 2 months. The Taliban ended up dropping the kid off outside of a restaurant. The kid looked incredibly malnourished. His hair was poorly cut and they put him in girls' clothing. It was a very traumatizing experience for him and the entire family. They would up finding the kidnappers 2 months later. The Pakistani police invited all the male members of the family to come and have a couple of words with the perps before they were punished. Don't really know what happened after. A girl I was friends with in school told me this story about her brother. Her family used to live in England before moving to Ireland, and her brother, let's call him B, he is about 10 years older than us, was around 3 at the time. The family went to a carnival one morning and were horrified to realize that B had gone missing. It was one of those moments where you take your eye off the kid for a split second and the next they've just vanished into thin air. They spent the whole day looking around the carnival and the surrounding area with the help of security, yet they couldn't find him. At around 9 PM, he just appears where he was last seen. He wasn't hurt in any way and he didn't seem distressed. In fact, he seemed like his cheerful little self. He mentioned something about a big man, but despite the parents' questions, he never divulged any other information. Thinking back on this as an adult, I'd say maybe the big man was someone who lost a child and wanted to spend a day playing daddy son to fill that gap. I feel bad for adults who genuinely enjoy spending time with children and can't because they don't have their own. There's not many good ways to fill that hole. There was the girl, Lauren, and her sister Ashley, whose parents were friends of my husband's father. They lived in Nuevo Laredo, Mexican City on the border, but sent their daughters to live here with the church pastor in Laredo. Ashley did well and had good grades. but Lauren became a rebel teen and ended up dating some butthole guy who was way too old for her. Every weekend Lauren and Ashley are dropped off downtown so they can walk across the bridge to Mexico and meet their mother on the other side to spend the weekend with their parents. On the usual Friday, Lauren had her backpack of clothes and her passport. Ashley was unable to go because she had a recital that night. Her mom called the pastor asking why Lauren never showed up. The pastor is alarmed and say that she was dropped off like usual. They ask Ashley if she knew where Lauren was, but Ashley said she didn't. Her parents contact my father-in-law and begin crying, worrying. My husband and I do some Facebook investigating and discover Lauren had 2 Facebook profiles, one under a fake name. She was supposedly pregnant. Her boyfriend was actually 21 and not in high school, and he lived in Mexico, not the US. Lauren is 17. Her 18th birthday is next month. We still don't know where Lauren is. It's been about 9 months. We assume she is somewhere in Mexico. Both her Facebook profiles haven't been updated. She hasn't contacted her sister. The boyfriend's mother says that she hasn't spoken to her son since he moved out at 18 and wouldn't know where he is. The best case scenario is that she's a high school dropout mother somewhere in Mexico. The worst case scenario is she was picked up by cartel while waiting for her mom in Mexico. Her sister was forced to leave school and move back to Mexico with her parents. They still keep in contact with my father-in-law. They switch between anger and cursing her to sobbing uncontrollably. Ashley developed an anxiety disorder because she feels no one believes that she doesn't know where Lauren is. When I was 13, I had a birthday party at my house. I invited my friend Kelly and her best friend Nikki, who was known as the bad kid. My friends and I were excited when we could go to the mall without parents, and she smoked weed and had an older BF. Anyways, Kelly and Nikki walked from Nikki's house to mine for the party, which was just a few blocks away and you could see them most of the time. So when Kelly and Nikki said they left their bathing suits at Nikki's house and asked to walk back to get them, no one thought anything about it. Kelly's mom even gave her permission. Fast forward a bit and we realize they're gone. Call Nikki's mom. They never showed up. We ended up making missing posters and posting them all over town and alerting police in several counties and states. They were found 2 weeks later at a gas station in Ohio. I lived in Northwest Indiana. They figured Nikki's boyfriend drove them to a certain point and just said good luck. It's been more than 10 years since that happened. Kelly is happily married with 2 kids now, and Nikki is a stripper with a kid and, from what I gather on FB, happily engaged. When I was in kindergarten, I used to take the school bus in the afternoon, half days. And one day I must have fallen asleep on the way home because I remember waking up at night in the back of the bus to a man different from my bus driver telling me everything would be alright. He turned out to be the bus manager coming in for work the next day, and the bus driver hadn't checked if any kids were left. I must have been gone for 15 hours after school let out, and I ended up at a skateland in a different city where the buses were kept overnight. It gave my mother a huge scare and she was convinced I was kidnapped. Luckily I wasn't, but after that I never took the bus. Something similar happened in my hometown. The bus drivers have to now walk through the bus to check for children and stick an OK sign on the back window. A few days ago, on Christmas Day, I was driving home from a Christmas function when I spotted a very small, 2-year-old child running through a deserted parking lot. I immediately stopped and yelled at her just before she ran out into a busy highway. I don't remember the last time I was that scared. I ran up to her, looking for any sign of an adult anywhere. Also, we are in Iowa, where it was 30 degrees Fahrenheit. This little girl was barefoot and coatless, with a steady stream of snot coming out of her nose. I walked up to her and she raised her arms and said, "Mommy." I stuck her in my car and called 911. I tried talking to her, but she could really only say a few words. She was never upset, and we just chilled for 30 minutes until police arrived. As the cop was taking my information, this kid's dad came walking out to the cop car and said, "Is that my freaking daughter?" I thought she was in her room watching a movie, and her mom was off crying about some stupid crap, so she didn't know where the frick she was. I don't know how she got out. My heart just sank. I wish I could have just kept her. Poor baby. A girl I taught at summer camp a few years back disappeared last year. She came home and just vanished. Her purse was found on a hiking trail like 30 minutes from her home. There's been no details released. It's even more sad because she has a baby. According to the local news, the baby is with her mom. I have been unfortunate to know 2 girls who were abducted, assaulted, and then killed when I was a kid. Both were my age at the times of their kidnappings, and through the chance coincidence of moving between 2 different cities between the times of the incidents. The first happened when I was in 5th grade, right after I had moved. The girl was out riding her bike and more than likely was hit by a car owned by her abductor. He took her, abused her, then later dumped the body near a state park 100 miles away. But same thing happened 2 years later to another girl. The thing that got me at that age was how much they looked like me and how it happened to both of them. I think for a while I was paranoid he was coming after me. I was in junior high at the time of the second abduction, and my mother wouldn't let me walk home alone from school or log 4 blocks because of it. We even ended up debating in class whether or not it was ethically right to enact the death penalty in that state. Then about 10 years ago, as an adult, and it hit me just as hard, a friend of mine who was a photographer had gone missing. Granted, she wasn't a kid, but we were all starting out in our adult lives at that time. She had gone to photograph a car for a client of hers, was abducted, assaulted, then killed. Her family to this day is still distraught over it, especially as it's still controversial and in the media due to a documentary that was just released that questioned the guilt of the perpetrator in her case. The first 2 I knew were victims of the same man. The third was the victim of a man who had been falsely accused of assaulting a woman 18 years prior and had been released from prison. When I was in HS, there was a student who was extremely independent who would go on solo hiking, fishing, camping trips fairly regularly. One year he just never came back from the woods. There were search parties and the whole deal. Never found any sign of him. No one knows what happened, but it's assumed an animal got him or he drowned or something like that. Really sad. Great guy. One of my good friends had a little brother who up and disappeared one day. He was always a pretty good kid, and his brother was one of the smartest people I think I'll ever meet. Working for Exxon now and was the valedictorian of my school. Anyway, I helped my buddy put up missing posters all over town, and for 2 days the family was a wreck. Until, one day, someone saw him hanging out behind Best Buy eating pizza a couple days later. He ran away because he got a bad grade on a paper. He was 14. Everybody is fine now. The kid in question ended up going to the same college I did. Seems to be okay, but still a scary thought as to what it could have been. Jesus, that's a wacky overreaction. I was once upset at a grade I got in high school on a test, so I removed the staple and slowly ate the test. This kid needs to learn what performance art is. I used to hang out with a girl whose family moved to our small town from Ukraine and her brother went missing. What was sad was there were no search parties or anything, just flyers hung up with his picture. I'm assuming because he was 19. Anyway, the flyers stayed up for years, getting replaced when ruined. 6 years later, a lady walking her dog found a jawbone in the woods. It was his. What's crazy is I remember when he first went missing, everyone saying he probably went out in the woods, dug a hole, sat in it, got drunk, and fell asleep. He's fine. So maybe that's what happened. That's a stoic way of saying he committed suicide. A girl who used to sit beside me in music class went missing. I remember her mum coming into the class with pictures begging all of us for information on her daughter. It was heartbreaking to hear her, and despite the encounter happening 23 years ago, I remember it very clearly. Sadly, the girl's remains were found a few months later and it was determined she was murdered, and it remains an unsolved mystery. The other kid I didn't know, though I did know his sister, who was also in my music class. He was at a bush party not far from the center of town. He decided to take a shortcut home and was never seen again. It was a wooded area but not all that remote. The wooded area is between 2 towns with populations around 20k. Nothing was ever found and it is like he just walked off the face of the planet. There's something wrong with your music class, mate. My mother met and became very close friends with a guy who had been kidnapped when he was 11 years old. But they both went to high school together and he was the popular kid and star athlete for several of the school sports, which is surprising given what happened. His name was Jody Plouch and he was enrolled in a local karate class in Louisiana. His instructor was apparently groping and assaulting Jody several times either before or after class. Eventually the instructor just flat out took Jody and told him they were going to Disneyland, where it was proved Jody was groped more and sodomized. While they were in the hotel and the instructor was in the shower, Jody was able to call his parents and tell them where he was, which allowed the police to come in and get him. After he was found and brought home safely, a few days later the karate teacher was flown back to Louisiana so he could be charged. Waiting by a payphone in the airport was Jody's father. When the perpetrator walked past him he turned around and put a bullet in his brain from 3 feet away, killing him instantly. Jody's father never went to prison for this, as the Louisiana jury decided any of us would have done the same thing if it were our child. There's an E60 episode on the whole thing, and Jody has done several interviews with Oprah and others. My mother is still friends with him, and I've met him a few times. Really nice guy, and he occasionally does motivational speaking around the area for younger kids. It's nice to see he turned out alright and has made it into something positive. Jesus Christ. Good on that jury. Poor father was probably out of his mind in rage and sorrow at that point, and the poor kid didn't need to have to testify all of the horrors in public. There was a little girl that went missing in New Zealand ages ago, maybe in 2011 or 2012. Dunno. Her mum turned away from her while she was playing to do some laundry, and when she turned back around she was gone. Divers found her a few months later in a sewer pipe. She must have fallen in a drain or something. Freaking horrible. In my very middle class, very safe, and sheltered little suburb, a 13-year-old girl went missing. She used to go to my school, and when she went missing everyone freaked out. Mass texts like, if you see a girl with brown hair, description, her name is, name, please call, number, kept going around and everyone was talking about her. Everyone who ever might have crossed paths with her told their stories. It was believed she ran away from home, because she had done it before. Most times she came back within a day or two, but this time she had been gone 3 days. Another couple of days later, a family was walking through a park and they found her hanging from a tree. About 30 years ago, I was in 1st grade, eating lunch. This was back when the milk cartons had missing children pictures on them. I grabbed my milk carton, and on the side of it was a picture of my friend, who I was sitting right next to at the time. It turns out during summer break, his divorced parents got in an argument and his dad abducted him and tried to take him to Mexico. He was found and had returned in time to make it to the beginning of school, so none of us knew what happened until he showed up on everyone's milk carton. This is an old family story, and you know how those can be. Sometimes things are passed along that turn out to be wildly inaccurate, but I believe it, and the story has always seemed very haunting, tragic, and horrifying to me. A part of my family was in a wagon train going west when their 5-year-old daughter, Rebecca, wandered off. The wagon train stayed around an extra couple of days, but winter was coming and they didn't want to be stuck, like, for example, the Donner Party, so they kept going. Her parents and siblings stayed behind a few days longer, but every day meant they were further and further from the group, and eventually they had to give up on Rebecca and go catch up to the wagon train without her. I always hoped she was found and raised by Native Americans, but the reality is that she probably died in the woods, either from an animal, drowning, or exposure. I would believe it. I used to work with a lady who grew up on a reservation and she told me they had lots of stories about these things from those times. Both natives and other children wandering off and losing their lives from the elements. She said it was an area that was very woodsy, quarry-like. If you are new to the channel, you can subscribe. I publish new videos every day. Until then, check another video. Bye for now.